The formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the Resolute 6 hours after the last Kryth weapon fell silent. And Ambassador Yun Seora stood beside Admiral Park as Supreme Commander. Vex'al entered the conference room with his head bowed in defeat. The Kryth commander looked smaller somehow, as if the events of the past hours had physically diminished him in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion. He approached the table where the surrender documents waited, and he studied the terms that would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy for generations to come. These terms are generous, Vex'al said in a voice that carried no emotion except weary surprise. You could demand much more given what has happened today. Admiral Park nodded slowly. We could, he agreed. We could strip your empire of its fleet and occupy your worlds, and force your people into servitude the way you plan to do to the Volanthi. He met the defeated commander's eyes without hatred or contempt. But what would that accomplish except to plant seeds of resentment that would grow into future wars? Park continued. You attacked our allies and we stopped you. And now we need to build a peace that can actually last. The surrender terms required the Kryth to withdraw from all conquered Volanthi territories immediately and to pay reparations. That would help rebuild the worlds they had destroyed. They would submit to weapons inspections for the next 100 years to ensure they could not rebuild their offensive capabilities without oversight, but they would keep their empire and their government and their dignity, and their people would not suffer collective punishment for the crimes of their military leaders. Vex'al signed the documents with trembling hands, and then he looked up at the human admiral with a question burning in his eyes. Why? He asked. You have proven that you could destroy us completely if you wished. Why show mercy to enemies who showed none to others? Park was silent for a long moment before he answered. Because we have been where you are now, he said. Humanity spent most of its history fighting wars against itself. And we nearly destroyed our own civilization more times than I can count. He gestured toward the viewport where the debris of the battle still drifted against the stars. We learned that cruelty breeds resentment, and resentment breeds revenge. And revenge breeds more war until there is nothing left to fight over. Park explained. The only way to break that cycle is to offer your enemy a path toward reconciliation, even when they do not deserve it. Ambassador Yun listened to this exchange, and she found herself understanding humanity in ways that she never had before. They were not simply powerful warriors who had hidden their strength until the right moment. They were survivors of their own violent nature, who had found wisdom through suffering, and who now tried to spare others from making the same mistakes they had made. The galaxy will never forget what happened here today, she said when the ceremony was complete. Every species that hears about this battle will reassess everything they thought they knew about humanity. Park nodded, but his expression remained serious. That is what concerns me, he admitted. We have revealed ourselves, and there is no going back now. And I worry about how others will react when they realize how powerful we have become. He turned to face the ambassador directly. Some will see us as protectors, and others will see us as threats, he said. And we will need friends like the Volanthi to help us navigate whatever comes next. Yun understood what he was asking, and she did not hesitate with her answer. You saved my people from extinction, she said. We will stand beside you for as long as the stars burn. In the days that followed, the news of the battle spread across the galaxy at the speed of light and faster as every species with access to faster-than-light communication shared the recordings and reports of what had happened in the Volanthi home system. 12 human ships had engaged over 300 Kryth warships. The battle had lasted 5 hours and 12 minutes. The Kryth had lost 247 vessels destroyed, and the remaining ships had surrendered human. Casualties totaled 17 dead and 32 wounded. It was the most lopsided victory in recorded galactic history, and it changed everything. Species that had dismissed humanity. As primitive newcomers began sending diplomatic missions to Earth with offers of alliance and trade. Species that had been considering aggressive expansion suddenly became much more interested in peaceful negotiation and the Kryath dominion. Once the most feared military power in the known galaxy began the long, slow process of learning how to exist. Without conquering everyone around them, Admiral Park attended the memorial service for his fallen crew members before the Resolute departed. For the journey home, he read each name aloud and spoke about who they had been and what they had meant to the people who loved them. 17 lives lost so that billions could be saved. It was a trade that the numbers said was worth making. But numbers could not capture the weight of grief that pressed down on the hearts of those who remained after the service. Park stood alone on the observation deck and watched the stars wheel slowly past as his ship prepared to leave the system. He had done what humanity asked of him, and he had done it well. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The big galaxy knew about humanity now, and there would be consequences both good and bad. Other species would test them and challenge them, and try to understand what made them so different from everyone else, and humanity would face those challenges the same way they had faced every challenge throughout their long and bloody history. Together, Ambassador Yunsiora sent her final report to the Velanti Council before the human fleet departed, and she ended it with words that would be quoted for centuries afterward. The humans came when no one else would. She wrote, "They fought for us when they had nothing to gain and everything to risk, and they showed mercy to our enemies even after those enemies drew their blood." She paused and considered her next words carefully before she continued. "I do not know what the future holds for our galaxy," she concluded, "but I know this. As long as humanity stands among the stars, the innocent will never be without hope." The human fleet jumped to faster than light speed and vanished into the darkness between the stars. Behind them they left a changed galaxy, and ahead of them lay a future that no one could predict but that everyone would help to build. Admiral Park Jinho stood motionless on the bridge of the Resolute as damage control teams rushed through the corridors. Behind him, and medical personnel carried the bodies of his fallen crew members toward the ship's morgue. 17 names that he would have to write letters for when this battle was over. 17 families that would receive the news that their loved ones had died defending strangers on the other side of the galaxy. He had known that casualties were possible when he accepted this mission, but knowing something in the abstract was very different from feeling the weight of actual loss pressing down on his shoulders. "Admiral," his communications officer said quietly, "the Kryath formation is regrouping for another attack, and their commander is broadcasting a message on all frequencies." Park nodded, and the main display flickered to show Supreme Commander Vexal standing on his bridge with triumph gleaming in his predatory eyes. "You see," Vexal announced to his remaining fleet, "the humans can bleed just like anyone else. And if we press our advantage now, we can end this farce and crush them beneath our superior numbers." He bared his teeth in that vicious smile that his species used to intimidate their enemies. "Attack again," he ordered. "And this time, do not stop until every human ship is burning wreckage." Admiral Park watched his enemies celebrate the deaths of his people, and he felt the cold thing in his chest grow harder and sharper with each passing second. He had spent his entire career training himself to fight without anger, because anger made soldiers sloppy and careless and prone to mistakes that got people killed. But there was a difference between anger and resolve. And right now, Park was filled with a resolve that burned brighter than any star in the galaxy. "Open a channel," he ordered, and his voice carried a weight that made every officer on the bridge stand a little straighter. "Broadcast on all frequencies and make sure the Kryath hear every word." His communications officer obeyed, and Park spoke directly to the enemy commander who had just ordered the deaths of 17 of his people. "Supreme Commander Vexal," he said, You have killed members of my crew, and under the conventions of human warfare, this changes the nature of our engagement." He paused to let his words translate through the Cryeth communication systems. "Until this moment, I was content to disable your fleet and accept your surrender." Park continued, "My people believe in mercy, and we take no pleasure in killing those who cannot fight back." His eyes narrowed and something ancient and dangerous stirred behind them. "But you have chosen to continue this battle after being given every opportunity to withdraw," he said. "And now I am going to show you what happens when humanity stops being merciful." He cut the transmission and turned to face his tactical officer. "New rules of engagement," he ordered. "All weapons free, all targets valid, and tell our ships to end this." The 12 human vessels that had been dancing through the Cryeth formation with surgical precision suddenly changed their behavior in ways that made Ambassador Yunsiora gasp in horror from her command bunker on the planet below. Before, the humans had been fighting like surgeons, carefully removing the ability of each enemy ship to fight while leaving the crews alive to surrender. Now they were fighting like Predator's missiles that had been targeting engines and weapons. Systems began striking reactor cores and ammunition magazines, and Cryeth warships that had been drifting helplessly began to explode as secondary detonations tore through their hulls. Human energy weapons that had been set to disable began firing at full power, and the beams cut through Cryeth armor like sunlight through morning mist. In 20 minutes, the 60 operational Cryeth warships were reduced to 40. In 30 minutes, they were down to 20. In 40 minutes, only 5 remained, including the flagship where Supreme Commander Vexal stood frozen in disbelief as he watched everything he had built crumble around him. "Impossible," he whispered as another one of his escorts vanished in a ball of expanding plasma. "This is impossible." His tactical officer turned to face him with terror written across every line of his face. "Supreme Commander," the officer said, "we must surrender. We cannot win this battle, and if we continue fighting, they will kill us all." Vexal wanted to argue, but he could not find the words because deep down he knew his officer was right. The humans had been holding back throughout the entire engagement. They had been giving his fleet every chance to recognize the hopelessness of their situation and choose surrender over annihilation, and he had responded by pressing the attack and killing their people, because he had been too arrogant to recognize defeat when it was staring him in the face. Now he was witnessing the consequences of that arrogance as his mighty armada died around him. "Supreme Commander," his officer pleaded. "Please." Vexal closed his eyes and felt something break inside him that he knew would never heal. "Broadcast on all frequencies," he ordered, in a voice that carried the weight of total defeat. "Tell them we surrender unconditionally." The transmission went out and the human ships immediately stopped firing. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vexal had ever heard. Admiral Park received word of the surrender, and he felt no satisfaction or joy, only a deep weariness that settled into his bones like winter cold. "Acknowledge their surrender," he ordered, "and dispatch medical ships to assist with their wounded." His officers looked surprised by that last order, but they obeyed without question. The humans had just destroyed the most powerful fleet in the HFY's known galaxy in less than 5 hours. Now they were going to help save the lives of the enemies they had just defeated. This was the human way of war. Terrible in victory, merciful in peace, and utterly incomprehensible to anyone who had never experienced both. Lieutenant Commander Beek Minjay gripped the arms of his station chair as the destroyer Indomitable executed another impossible turn that would have killed every person aboard if not for the inertial dampening technology that humanity had kept hidden from the rest of the galaxy. He was 34 years old, and he had trained for this moment since he was 18. But nothing in his simulations had prepared him for the reality of watching an entire enemy fleet fall apart before his eyes. The tactical display at his station showed over 100 Cryeth vessels already disabled, their engines dark and their weapons silent as human. Ships moved past them toward the remaining targets. Another flight of missiles incoming from the eastern formation. His sensor operator reported, 32 warheads tracking on our position. Minjay did not even need to give orders because the ship's automated defense systems were already responding to the threat. Point defense lasers reached out and touched each missile in sequence. And 32 explosions blossomed harmlessly in the void before any warhead came within 1,000 kilometers of the hull. He found himself thinking about the long journey that had brought humanity to this moment. And he remembered the lessons his instructors had taught him about the philosophy that guided their military doctrine. Humans were not natural warriors despite what their bloody history might suggest. They were survivors who had learned through centuries of terrible conflict that war was the worst possible solution to any problem, and that the only thing worse than fighting a war was losing one. The nations of Earth had nearly destroyed themselves countless times before they finally united under a single government. And the scars of those ancient conflicts had shaped everything about how humanity approached the galaxy. When they first achieved faster than light travel and discovered that the universe was full of alien civilizations, they had faced a difficult choice. Some voices argued that humanity should assert itself immediately and claim a position of power among the stars before anyone could challenge them. Others suggested that they should hide and avoid drawing attention until they understood the political landscape better. In the end, humanity chose a middle path that required patience and discipline and a willingness to be underestimated by everyone they met. They built a public fleet of 12 ships using technology they purchased from other species. And they made sure that everyone in the galaxy knew exactly how weak and primitive those ships were. Then they built their real fleet in secret. They studied every species they encountered and cataloged every weapon and tactic and strategy that anyone in the galaxy had ever used. They developed countermeasures for everything. And then they developed countermeasures for the countermeasures. They created ships that could outmaneuver anything in existence, and weapons that could bypass any defense system ever invented, and they waited for someone to need their help. Lieutenant Commander Beak had asked his commanding officer once why humanity bothered to help anyone at all when they could simply protect their own territory and ignore the suffering of alien species. The answer had stayed with him ever since, because we remember what it was like to suffer alone. Captain Wang had told him, we remember the wars and the famines and the plagues that nearly wiped us out before we learned to work together. And we remember that no one came to help us because there was no one to come. She had looked at him with eyes that carried the weight of all human history behind them. We cannot change the past, she had said, but we can make sure that when someone calls for help, there is an answer waiting in the darkness. The Indomitable shuddered as a lucky Cryeth shot grazed their forward shields. But the damage was minimal, and the ship continued its deadly dance through the enemy formation without slowing down. Minjay returned his attention to the battle and watched as another Cryeth cruiser went dark on his display. The humans were not trying to kill their enemies unless absolutely necessary. Every shot was aimed at engines or weapons or communication arrays, and the goal was to render each vessel helpless rather than to destroy it outright. This was the core of human military doctrine. Win quickly, win decisively, and leave your enemy alive to accept the peace that follows. Dead enemies could not surrender, and dead enemies could not learn from their defeat. But living enemies could be transformed into future allies if they were treated with enough wisdom and Mercy Supreme Commander Vexal did not understand this doctrine, and he was becoming increasingly desperate as his tactical display filled with the silent icons of his disabled ships. He had started the battle with 312 warships under his command. 2 hours had passed, and barely 60 of those vessels remained operational. Concentrate all remaining forces, he ordered through the static that filled his communication channels. Target the human flagship and destroy it at any cost. His surviving captains obeyed because they had no other options left. And 60 Kryth warships began to converge on the position where Admiral Park's vessel was coordinating the battle. The Resolute detected the approaching formation, and Admiral Park studied the enemy movements with the same calm focus he had maintained throughout the engagement. They are targeting us specifically, his tactical officer observed. Should we withdraw to a safer position? Park shook his head slowly. No, he said. Let them come and let them believe they have a chance. Because hope is the only thing keeping them fighting. And I want this battle to end with their surrender rather than their annihilation. The 60 Kryth ships formed a tight attack formation and unleashed everything they had remaining against the human flagship. For the first time in the battle, the Resolute shields flickered under the concentrated assault. For the first time, warning alarms began to sound on the bridge as damage reports flowed in from throughout the ship. For the first time, human blood was spilled as hull breaches claimed the lives of 17 crew members who never had a chance to reach the escape pods. Admiral Park felt something cold settle into his chest as he read the casualty report, and his expression changed in a way that made every officer on the bridge fall silent. The Kryth had killed his people. The rules of engagement were about to change. Fleet Admiral Park Jinho stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship Resolute and watched as his ships completed their emergence from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Volanthi home system. The tactical display before him showed exactly what intelligence had predicted. 312 Kryth warships arranged in an aggressive formation around the inner planets, with the enemy flagship positioned at the center of their fleet like a predator waiting for its prey to make one final desperate move. Park was 63 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for a moment exactly like this. He had never wanted war, and he had hoped that humanity would never need to reveal what they had built in secret over the past 4 decades. But the Volanthi were dying, and they had called for help. And humanity always honored its promises. Communications, he said in a calm voice that carried across the silent bridge. Open a channel on all frequencies and make sure every ship in this system can hear what I am about to say. His communications officer worked quickly and nodded when the channel was ready. Park took a deep breath and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. This is Fleet Admiral Park Jinho of the Terran Defense Force, he announced. We are invoking Article 7 of our Mutual Defense Agreement with the Volanthi Collective, and we are hereby ordering all Kryth vessels to withdraw from this system immediately. He paused for a moment to let his words sink in before he continued. You have 1 standard hour to begin your retreat, he said. There will be no negotiation, and there will be no second warning. And any vessel that remains in this system after that deadline will be considered a hostile combatant. The response from the Kryth came almost immediately in the form of mocking laughter, broadcast on the same open channel. Supreme Commander Vexal appeared on the main display screen, with his sharp teeth bared in what passed for a smile. Among his species 12 ships, Vexal said with amusement thick in his translated voice. You bring 12 pitiful ships to challenge an armada of 300, and you have the audacity to demand our surrender. He made a gesture that his subordinates recognized as the signal for attack. Kill them all. he ordered, and make sure to record their destruction so that other species will know what happens to those who challenge the Cryoth Dominion. 100 Cryoth warships opened fire simultaneously, and the space between the two fleets filled with plasma bolts and missile trails and energy beams of every description. Ambassador Yumsiora watched from her command bunker on the planet below, and she felt her hopes begin to die as she saw the overwhelming barrage racing toward the tiny human fleet. Then something impossible happened. The human ships moved. They did not simply accelerate or change direction like normal vessels, but rather they seemed to dance through the incoming fire as if the weapons were moving in slow motion compared to their impossible speed. Not a single shot connected with a human hull. Yoon heard one of her tactical officers make a sound of disbelief, and she understood exactly how he felt because she was making the same sound inside her own mind. That is not possible, the officer whispered. No ship can maneuver like that. The acceleration alone would kill any crew inside. But the humans were not dying, and their ships were not slowing down as they closed the distance toward the Cryoth Armada. With terrifying speed, Admiral Park watched his tactical display with the calm focus of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Deploy all drone squadrons, he ordered, and activate electronic warfare protocols across the entire enemy fleet. The 12 human ships seemed to split apart as hundreds of smaller craft launched from hidden bays along their hulls. And within seconds, the space around the fleet was filled with autonomous weapons, platforms and sensor drones and electronic warfare systems that the galaxy had never seen before. The warfare systems that the galaxy had never seen before. Effect on the Cryoth fleet was immediate and devastating. Their communications dissolved into static as human jamming systems overwhelmed every frequency they tried to use, and their targeting computers began to malfunction as viral programs invaded their networks through vulnerabilities that humanity had discovered years ago. Cryoth gunners found that their weapons were firing at empty space because their sensors were showing them ghost targets that did not exist, while the real human ships slipped past their defenses like shadows in the night. Shield frequency analysis complete, one of Park's officers reported, transmitting vulnerability data to all weapon systems now. The Cryoth had believed that their shields were impenetrable because no species had ever developed weapons powerful enough to break through their defensive barriers. They were about to learn that humanity had not tried to build more powerful weapons. Instead, they had simply figured out how to make the shields stop working. Human missiles began to strike Cryoth vessels, and the explosions tore through hulls that suddenly had no protection against the incoming warheads. Supreme Commander Veshel watched in horror as his mighty armada began to fall apart around him. What is happening? He demanded as another one of his ships went dark on his tactical display. How are they doing this? No one could answer him because no one understood what they were witnessing. The humans were not fighting like any species the Cryoth had ever encountered before. They were not trying to win through superior firepower or greater numbers or better positioning, but rather they seemed to know exactly where every Cryoth ship would be and exactly what every Cryoth captain would do before they did it. It was as if the humans had been studying them for years and had developed perfect countermeasures for every tactic in their arsenal, which was exactly what had happened. Admiral Park watched the battle unfold exactly as his strategists had predicted, and he felt no joy in the destruction that his fleet was causing. Humanity had not wanted this war, but they had prepared for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would threaten the innocent and someone would call for help. Focus on disabling their engines and weapons, he ordered. We want prisoners, not corpses, and every Kryth we kill today is a grievance that their empire will carry for generations." His gunners adjusted their targeting accordingly, and the battle shifted from destruction to systematic dismantlement, one by one. The Kryth warships fell silent as human weapons stripped away their ability to fight or flee, and the crews inside found themselves drifting helplessly, while their conquerors moved on to the next target, the hour that Admiral Park had given them to withdraw had not yet passed, and already the mightiest fleet in the known galaxy was being reduced to a collection of floating wreckage and disabled hulls. Ambassador Yoon Seora stood before the emergency council with her heart racing inside her chest, and she knew that what she was about to suggest would change everything for her people, and perhaps for the entire galaxy itself. The chamber was silent except for the distant rumble of explosions somewhere in the upper atmosphere, and every council member wore the same expression of exhausted terror on their faces as they waited for someone to offer them hope. "We must contact the humans," Yoon said, and her voice did not waver even though she felt the weight of countless lives pressing down upon her shoulders. The reaction was immediate, and exactly what she had expected from the gathered leaders of the Velanthi Collective. Elder Counselor Thren slammed his forearms against the table and made a sound of disgust that echoed through the ancient stone halls of the council chamber. "The humans are primitives," he declared, with absolute certainty in his voice. "They crawled out of their death world barely 40 years ago, and they have nothing to offer us except perhaps a few more ships for the Kryth to destroy." Yoon had prepared for this argument, and she pulled up the holographic display that showed the current state of their war against the Kryth Dominion. The images were devastating to behold. 18 months ago, the Kryth had launched their invasion without warning or provocation, and since then they had conquered 12 Velanthi worlds and killed over 2 billion civilians in the process. The Collective had started the war with a fleet of over 500 warships, but now only 63 remained operational, and most of those were damaged beyond full repair. 2 systems were all that stood between the Kryth and complete victory, and their homeworld was one of them. "We have tried everything else," Yoon said as she gestured at the grim statistics floating in the air before them. "We have begged the consortium for help, and they refused because they fear Kryth retaliation against their own territories." She moved to the next display, which showed the economic reports. "We have offered the mining guilds exclusive rights to our asteroid fields in exchange for military support, but they calculated that we would lose the war before they could profit from any agreement." The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats because they had all been present for those humiliating negotiations. "The Kryth have given us their terms," Yoon continued, and her voice grew harder with each word. "Complete surrender and the dissolution of the Velanthi Collective as a political entity, and our people would become a slave race serving their empire for the next 1,000 years." She paused to let that sink in before she spoke again. "The humans signed a mutual defense pact with us 30 years ago," she reminded them. "We thought it was meaningless at the time because what could such a young species possibly offer us? But now it is the only alliance we have that might actually mean something." Elder Counselor Thren made another dismissive gesture with his upper arms. "The humans have 12 warships," he said with contempt dripping from every syllable. 12 ancient vessels that would not last 5 minutes against a single Kryth battlecruiser. "And you want to summon them to fight an armada of 300 ships. I want to summon anyone who might be willing to stand beside us," Yoon replied, and she met his gaze without flinching. "Would you rather we die alone and forgotten? Or would you prefer that at least someone bears witness to our final stand?" The vote was closer than she had expected, but in the end the council authorized her to activate the emergency beacon that would summon humanity to their defense, She performed the activation herself in the communications center deep beneath the council building. And then she waited for a response. That might never come. 3 hours passed in silence. And Yoon began to wonder if the humans had simply ignored their distress call like everyone else in the galaxy. Then a single transmission arrived from somewhere impossibly far away. The message was brief and written in the simple direct style that humans seem to prefer for all their communications. Fleet dispatched. It read, "Hold position and do not engage the enemy. We will arrive within 36 hours." Yoon stared at those words for a long time, and she felt something strange stirring in her chest that she eventually recognized as hope. She reported the response to the council and watched as relief and skepticism warred on their faces in equal measure. Meanwhile, the Kryth continued their advance toward the Volanthi home system with the confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Supreme Commander Vexal received word that the humans had been summoned, and his reaction was BROADCAST to every ship in his fleet as a source of amusement. The desperate prey has called for help from the cave dwellers of that toxic little world, he announced with cruel laughter in his voice. Let them come with their 12 rust buckets and their primitive weapons, and we will crush them alongside their Volanthi pets. His officers roared their approval, and the celebration continued. Late into the ship's night cycle, Vexal had studied the humans during his long career, and he had never been impressed by what he learned about them. They were a young species that had achieved faster than light travel through luck rather than skill, and they had spent most of their spacefaring years hiding in their small corner of the galaxy while the real powers fought and traded around them. Their ships were outdated designs based on technology they had purchased from other species, and their military had never been tested in actual combat against a serious opponent. He estimated that the war would be over within the week, regardless of whether the humans showed up or not. What Vexal did not know was that humanity had been watching the galaxy very carefully for the past 4 decades. They had studied every major species and cataloged every weapon system and mapped every fleet movement with patience that bordered on obsession. They had built their public fleet of 12 ships to appear old and weak and unthreatening, and they had built their real fleet in secret shipyards hidden throughout their territory where no alien sensor had ever penetrated. The humans had learned many lessons from their violent history on Earth, and the most important lesson was this: never show your true strength until the moment you are ready to use it. Ambassador Yoon did not sleep during the 36 hours that followed her distress call, and she spent most of that time watching the Kryth armada grow larger on her tactical displays. When the human fleet finally arrived at the edge of her home system, she witnessed something that would stay with her until the day she died. 12 ships emerged from faster than light travel, exactly as expected, but those ships were nothing like the primitive vessels that the galaxy believed humanity possessed. They were sleek and angular and covered in technology that no Volanthi scientist could identify, and they moved through space with a grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics themselves. Yoon realized in that moment that humanity had been lying to everyone for 40 years, and now the galaxy was about to learn the truth.